Andrew Mountbatten Windsor sits in his 30-room mansion at Royal Lodge, surrounded by silver service dinners and crates of champagne that arrive weekly, but the walls are closing in on the man who was once known to the world as Prince Andrew, Duke of York. October and November of 2025 have witnessed something unprecedented in modern British royal history, a spectacular and complete dismantling of a prince's identity, title by title, honor by honor, until nothing remained but a name and a scandal that refuses to fade. What happened in these explosive weeks represents not just the fall of one man, but a reckoning that the British monarchy could no longer avoid, a moment when the weight of allegations, public outrage, and a posthumous memoir from a woman who dared to speak her truth finally became too heavy for even the ancient institution of the crown to bear. The earthquake began on October 17, 2025, when Buckingham Palace released a statement that sent shockwaves through royal circles and beyond. Prince Andrew announced that he would no longer use his titles or the honors conferred upon him, citing that continued accusations against him distracted from the work of King Charles and the royal family. In discussion with the king and his immediate and wider family, Andrew declared he was putting his duty to family and country first, just as he had done 5 years earlier when he stepped back from public life. But even as he relinquished the use of these titles, Andrew maintained his stance, vigorously denying the accusations against him as he had consistently done throughout the ordeal. The statement appeared to be an attempt to draw a line under years of controversy, to finally silence the relentless drumbeat of negative headlines that had followed him since his catastrophic BBC Newsnight interview in November 2019, but the palace had severely underestimated the depth of public anger and the determination of those seeking accountability. The timing of Andrew's announcement was no coincidence. Just days before, on October 21, a book had been published that would prove to be a turning point in the entire saga. Nobody's Girl, the posthumous memoir of Virginia Giuffre, hit shelves and immediately became a #1 New York Times bestseller. Giuffre, who had died by suicide in April 2025 at the age of 41, left behind a devastating account of her experiences, written in her own words with unflinching honesty. The world had known Virginia Giuffre as Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell's most outspoken victim, the woman whose decision to speak out helped send both serial abusers to prison, whose photograph with Prince Andrew, showing her in a pink top and shiny jeans with the prince's arm around her waist, had become one of the most recognizable images of the entire scandal. But her full story had never been told until now, and what emerged from the pages of Nobody's Girl was a portrait of systemic abuse, trafficking, and the complicity of powerful men who believed their status placed them above accountability. In her memoir, Giuffre detailed 3 alleged sexual encounters with Prince Andrew in London, New York, and on Epstein's private Caribbean island. She described how Ghislaine Maxwell woke her one day in March 2001 to tell her she was to be like Cinderella that day because she would meet a handsome prince. Giuffre was 17 years old at the time. She recalled Prince Andrew guessing her age correctly and noting that his daughters were just a little younger than her. The memoir painted a picture of a man who, in Giuffre's words, acted as if he believed having sex with her was his birthright. These weren't vague allegations or second-hand accounts, they were detailed, specific, and deeply personal recollections that made uncomfortable reading for anyone who still harbored doubts about the nature of Andrew's involvement with Epstein and Maxwell. But Nobody's Girl went further than just recounting past events. Giuffre also alleged that Andrew's team had tried to hire internet trolls to harass her and that Andrew had insisted the settlement of her civil lawsuit against him in 2022 include a 1-year gag order to prevent allegations from tarnishing the late Queen Elizabeth's Platinum Jubilee celebrations. The book revealed that despite Andrew's repeated claims that he had severed all ties with Jeffrey Epstein in 2010, evidence suggested otherwise. In the weeks following the memoir's publication, British newspapers reported on emails that appeared to show Andrew reaching out to Epstein in 2011, telling him to keep in close touch and that they were in this together. London's Metropolitan Police announced they were actively looking into reports that Andrew had asked a police officer assigned to him as a bodyguard to dig up dirt on Giuffre, requesting her date of birth and social security number in an apparent attempt to discredit her before the famous photograph came to light. The public reaction to Nobody's Girl was immediate and visceral. Readers were moved by Giuffre's courage and devastated by her tragic death just months before the book's release. Her family released a statement saying that today an ordinary American girl from an ordinary American family brought down a British prince with her truth and extraordinary courage. Virginia Giuffre, our sister, a child when she was sexually assaulted by Andrew, never stopped fighting for accountability for what had happened to her and to countless other survivors like her. Sky Roberts, Giuffre's brother, spoke emotionally about the impact of the memoir, noting that his sister's children would now know their mother as somebody who really did something in this world, that she actually spread a lot of good and was able to hold people to account. The weight of these words, combined with the detailed allegations in the memoir, created a pressure cooker environment that Andrew's October 17 statement did absolutely nothing to relieve. Within days of Andrew's announcement that he would stop using his titles, the criticism intensified rather than subsided. Media outlets began focusing on Andrew's living arrangements at Royal Lodge, a sprawling 30-room mansion in the heart of Windsor Great Park, near Windsor Castle. Freedom of Information Act requests revealed that Andrew had paid just £1 million for the lease in 2004 and had been paying what was described as one peppercorn if demanded per annum in rent ever since. This sweetheart deal, combined with the £7.5 million Andrew had reportedly spent on refurbishment, raised serious questions about how a man who had stepped back from royal duties 6 years earlier and supposedly had no significant income beyond his naval pension of £20,000 per year could afford to maintain such a lavish lifestyle. Parliament's spending watchdog, the Public Accounts Committee, wrote to the Treasury and the Crown Estate demanding an explanation for the rationale behind the lease arrangement, setting a deadline of November 28 for a response. Questions also swirled around the multi-million-pound settlement Andrew had paid to Virginia Giuffre in 2022 to resolve her civil lawsuit. Where had that money come from? Andrew's finances had always been something of a mystery. Reports suggested that his late mother, Queen Elizabeth, had provided him with an annual allowance of about £1 million, and that these payments had initially continued under King Charles before being stopped. But without working as a royal since 2019, without significant declared income beyond his naval pension, how was Andrew funding his lifestyle? The lack of transparency only fueled public suspicion and anger. Critics pointed out that while victims of abuse struggled to be heard and believed, while Virginia Giuffre had ultimately taken her own life, Andrew was living in luxury at what amounted to taxpayer expense, protected by his royal status even as he claimed to step away from it. The pressure on King Charles and the wider royal family became unbearable. Prince William, the heir to the throne, was reportedly pushing for his uncle's situation to be resolved quickly and decisively. Sources indicated that William wanted Andrew to vacate Royal Lodge by bonfire night, November 5, as William was planning to move his young family to their forever home at Forest Lodge, near Andrew's residence, in the coming days. The prospect of having the disgraced former prince as a neighbor was clearly unacceptable. Democratic Congressman Shuhas Subramaniam in the United States had called for Andrew to testify before a congressional committee about his links to Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. Campaign groups like Republic, which advocates for the abolishment of the monarchy, described Andrew's voluntary relinquishment of titles as too little, too late. The consensus was clear: Andrew's half measures were not enough, and the royal family's reputation would continue to suffer until more decisive action was taken. On October 30, 2025, Buckingham Palace dropped a bombshell that made international headlines and marked an almost unprecedented moment in British royal history. The palace announced that King Charles had initiated a formal process to remove the style, titles, and honors of Prince Andrew. The statement was stark and uncompromising. Prince Andrew would now be known as Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. His lease on Royal Lodge had, to date, provided him with legal protection to continue in residence, but formal notice had now been served to surrender the lease and he would move to alternative private accommodation. These censures were deemed necessary, notwithstanding the fact that he continues to deny the allegations against him. Their Majesties wished to make clear that their thoughts and utmost sympathies had been and would remain with the victims and survivors of any and all forms of abuse. The language was extraordinary. The use of the word censures, the explicit acknowledgement of victims and survivors, the coldly formal tone, all of it represented a complete severing of ties between the monarchy and one of its own. Andrew was not just losing titles, he was being cast out, expelled from the institution that had defined his entire existence. He would no longer be Prince Andrew. He would no longer be Duke of York, Earl of Inverness, or Baron Killyleague. The style His Royal Highness was gone. The honors including the Order of the Garter and Knight Grand Cross of the Royal Victorian Order were stripped away. Every marker of his royal status, save for the accident of his birth, was being systematically removed. The process was formalized through letters patent, official documents issued under the Great Seal of the realm. On November 3, 2025, an entry appeared in the Gazette, the United Kingdom's official public record, stating that the king had been pleased by letters patent dated November 3 to declare that Andrew Mountbatten Windsor shall no longer be entitled to hold and enjoy the style, title, or attribute of Royal Highness in the titular dignity of Prince. This was not a symbolic gesture or a public relations move. This was a legal act that fundamentally altered Andrew's status. The last time something similar had occurred was over 100 years ago, in 1917, when Prince Charles Edward, one of Queen Victoria's grandsons, had the title of Duke of Albany stripped from him under the Titles Deprivation Act for fighting for Germany during World War I. Before that, King Edward VIII had abdicated the throne in 1936 to Mary Wallace Simpson, but that had been a voluntary choice. Prince Andrew's case represented the most serious demotion of a senior British royal in living memory, a formal punishment for conduct that the palace had finally acknowledged could no longer be tolerated. Andrew was also ordered to leave Royal Lodge and move to a property on the private Sandringham estate in Norfolk, which would be privately funded by King Charles. The palace did not specify which property on the 20,000-acre estate Andrew would occupy, only that the move would take place as soon as practicable. His ex-wife, Sarah Ferguson, who had been living with him at Royal Lodge despite their divorce in 1996, would also move out and make her own living arrangements. She had reverted to her maiden name earlier in October when Andrew first relinquished the use of his titles, and she would no longer be known as the Duchess of York. Their daughters, Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, would retain their titles as daughters of the son of a sovereign, in line with a directive issued by King George V in 1917. Beatrice and Eugenie were non-working royals, living their own lives away from the spotlight, and the palace was careful to make clear that they would not be punished for their father's actions. The public response to the October 30th announcement was mixed. Many felt it was long overdue, a necessary step that should have been taken years earlier. Virginia Giuffre's family issued a statement saying that today an ordinary American girl from an ordinary American family brought down a British prince with her truth and extraordinary courage, and that they would not rest until the same accountability applied to all of her abusers and abettors connected to Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. Sky Roberts, Giuffre's brother, told media outlets that it had been a joyous and happy and sad day, acknowledging the bittersweet nature of seeing accountability come too late to bring his sister peace while she was alive. Advocates for abuse survivors praised the royal family's decision, seeing it as a sign that even the most powerful institutions could be forced to act when public pressure became overwhelming. However, critics like the campaign group Republic maintained that the move was still too little, too late. They argued that the royal family had protected Andrew for far too long, that the palace should have acted swiftly and decisively after the BBC Newsnight interview in 2019, or after Virginia Giuffre filed her civil lawsuit in 2021, or after the multi-million-pound settlement in 2022. Instead, Andrew had been allowed to live in luxury at Royal Lodge, receiving financial support from the late Queen and then from King Charles, while his accusers continued to suffer. The fact that it took a posthumous memoir and renewed media scrutiny in 2025 to finally force action was, in their view, a damning indictment of the monarchy's priorities. Polling data supported the view that Andrew had become toxic to the royal family's reputation. A YouGov poll published on October 30 found that 91% of Britons had a negative opinion of Andrew, with only 4% viewing him positively. By contrast, Prince William enjoyed a 76% approval rating, King Charles 62%, and the monarchy as an institution maintained a 56% positive rating overall. Andrew was dragging down the entire family, and the decision to cut him loose was as much about protecting the institution as it was about responding to public demands for accountability. King Charles, who had waited his entire life to become king and who was now battling his own health issues, could not afford to have his reign defined by his brother's scandals. Prince William, who would one day inherit the throne, was even more determined to distance the monarchy from Andrew and to demonstrate that the royal family was not above the law or immune to consequences. In the days and weeks following the October 30th announcement, new details emerged about Andrew's situation and his response to the upheaval. Despite the official stripping of his titles and the order to vacate Royal Lodge, reports suggested that Andrew was in no hurry to comply and that his lifestyle had changed remarkably little. Insiders speaking to tabloid outlets claimed that Andrew was still acting completely entitled, insisting on being waited on hand and foot at great cost to King Charles's personal coffers. He reportedly still hosted his friends, though the guest list had dwindled to mostly hangers-on as the London social set turned their backs on him. He continued to order in crates of champagne and fine wines every week, insisted on a proper silver service dinner every night even if it was just him and Sarah Ferguson, and maintained a huge breakfast spread that could feed a small army. Sources described him as just as gluttonous and wasteful as always, refusing to compromise on quality despite his fallen status. Some royal staffers reportedly still referred to him as His Royal Highness behind closed doors, a sign that old habits and loyalties died hard within the palace ecosystem. Andrew was said to be under 24-hour surveillance, presumably to ensure he complied with the restrictions placed on him and perhaps to monitor who he was in contact with. Yet despite all of this, reports suggested his mood had done a complete 180. Friends claimed he was feeling oddly liberated, freer than he had been in decades, now that he no longer had to play the royal. There were even rumors that he was joking about signing up for dating apps and hitting the pub like a regular guy, throwing parties again, and generally enjoying a sense of freedom from the constraints of royal duty. If true, this represented a remarkable level of denial or compartmentalization, given the gravity of the allegations against him and the very public nature of his disgrace. The question of where Andrew would actually end up living remained somewhat unclear as November progressed. The Sandringham estate, where he was supposed to relocate, is massive, covering approximately 20,000 acres with 600 acres of gardens. The palace had not specified which property on the estate would be his new home, and there was speculation that the move might be timed to avoid potential awkwardness over the holidays, as Sandringham is traditionally where the royal family gathers for Christmas. It had been previously announced that Andrew would be excluded from Christmas celebrations, a clear signal that his banishment was complete. The symbolism of a man who had once been at the heart of royal occasions, who had been Queen Elizabeth's favorite son, now being barred from family gatherings was not lost on observers. Meanwhile, the legal and political ramifications of Andrew's situation continued to unfold. On November 7, 2025, 16 Democratic members of the United States House of Representatives signed a letter addressed to Mr. Mountbatten Windsor, as Andrew was now publicly known, requesting that he sit for a transcribed interview with the House Oversight Committee's investigation into Jeffrey Epstein. The letter referenced Virginia Giuffre's memoir, specifically her claims that she had feared retaliation if she made allegations against Andrew and that he had asked his personal protection officer to dig up dirt on her. The letter asked Andrew to respond by November 20. The U.S. Congress had no power to compel testimony from foreigners, making it unlikely that Andrew would agree to give evidence, but the request represented yet another unwelcome development for the disgraced former prince. It demonstrated that the scrutiny was not limited to the United Kingdom, that Andrew's alleged involvement in the Epstein scandal had international dimensions and that demands for accountability were coming from multiple jurisdictions. Democratic lawmakers in the United States also turned the spotlight on Zorro Ranch, a secluded desert property in New Mexico that Jeffrey Epstein had purchased in 1993. State Representative Andrea Romero proposed to the House of Representatives Courts, Corrections, and Justice Interim Committee that a commission be created to investigate alleged crimes against young girls at the property, which featured a hilltop mansion and private runway about 56 kilometers south of Santa Fe. Several survivors of Epstein's abuse had signaled that sex trafficking activity extended to the ranch, and the push for a truth commission represented an effort to uncover the full extent of Epstein's crimes and the network of enablers who had facilitated them. Andrew's name inevitably came up in these discussions, given his close ties to Epstein and the allegations detailed in Virginia Giuffre's memoir. The broader question of accountability loomed large. Ghislaine Maxwell, Epstein's longtime associate who had been convicted of crimes related to the sexual abuse of minors, was serving a 20-year sentence in Texas. Jeffrey Epstein himself had died by suicide in a New York prison cell in August 2019 while awaiting trial on federal sex trafficking charges. But what about the other men, the princes and politicians, billionaires and celebrities, who had spent time with Epstein and who had been accused by multiple victims of participating in or benefiting from his trafficking operation? Files from Epstein's estate continued to be released by the U.S. House Oversight Committee, and there was ongoing media speculation about whose names would feature in those documents. President Donald Trump, who had known Epstein and had been photographed with him on multiple occasions, had been asked earlier in October about the possibility of pardoning Maxwell. Trump responded that he would take a look at it and speak to the Department of Justice, noting that he wouldn't consider it or not consider it without knowing more. The fact that a potential pardon for one of Epstein's key accomplices was even being discussed by the President of the United States underscored how deeply the scandal reached into the highest levels of power. For Prince Andrew, now Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, the stripping of his titles represented a kind of civil death, a complete erasure of the identity he had held since birth. He was no longer a prince, no longer a duke, no longer His Royal Highness. He was just Andrew, a 65-year-old man with a tarnished reputation, dwindling finances, and a legacy defined entirely by scandal. The contrast with his earlier life could not have been starker. Born in 1960 as the third child and second son of Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip, Andrew had been the spare to the heir, a position that came with royal privilege but also with less scrutiny than his older brother Charles. He had served in the Royal Navy, notably as a helicopter pilot during the Falklands War in 1982, a service that earned him genuine respect and admiration. He had married Sarah Ferguson in a fairy tale wedding in 1986, though the marriage had ended in divorce 10 years later. He had held numerous military titles and royal patronages, had represented the monarchy on official visits around the world, and had been seen as a valued member of the royal family. But Andrew's judgment had always been questionable. His friendships with controversial figures, his business dealings that often raised eyebrows, his sense of entitlement that occasionally manifested in petty and embarrassing ways, all of these had earned him a reputation as an arrogant and out-of-touch royal even before the Epstein scandal erupted. The November 2019 BBC Newsnight interview, in which Andrew attempted to defend himself against Virginia Giuffre's allegations, had been a catastrophic error. Viewers watched as Andrew offered implausible explanations, such as claiming he couldn't have been sweating during an alleged encounter with Giuffre at a nightclub because he had a medical condition that prevented him from sweating, a condition he said had developed after being shot at during the Falklands War and which had since been cured. He claimed he had been at a Pizza Express in Woking on the night in question, a detail that became the subject of widespread mockery. Most damningly, he failed to express any empathy for Epstein's victims, instead focusing on defending his own reputation and explaining why his friendship with Epstein had been beneficial for his work as a trade envoy. The interview had been so disastrous that Andrew announced just 4 days later that he would step back from public duties for the foreseeable future, with the full support of the Queen. But stepping back from public duties was not the same as facing consequences. Andrew continued to live at Royal Lodge, continued to receive financial support, continued to enjoy the trappings of royal life even as he was officially sidelined. In January 2022, after Virginia Giuffre filed her civil lawsuit, he was stripped of his military titles and royal patronages and stopped using the style His Royal Highness in an official capacity. But he still retained his other titles, still lived in his mansion, still had the protection and resources of the royal family behind him. It took the publication of Nobody's Girl in October 2025 and the massive public outcry that followed to finally force the royal family to take the ultimate step of stripping Andrew of his princely status entirely. The question now is what comes next for Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor. At 65 years old, with his reputation in tatters and his royal identity stripped away, what kind of life can he expect? He is deeply unpopular with the British public, with a 91% negative opinion rating that makes him one of the most disliked figures in the country. He has been effectively banished from royal life, excluded from family gatherings and official events. He is under intense media scrutiny, with every aspect of his finances, his living arrangements, and his social life subject to investigation and criticism. He faces ongoing calls to testify about his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, though it seems unlikely he will voluntarily submit to questioning by U.S. lawmakers or investigators. His ex-wife Sarah Ferguson has made her own living arrangements and will not be joining him at Sandringham, suggesting that even that relationship, which had endured despite their divorce, may be fracturing under the pressure. And yet, according to reports, Andrew seems oddly unbowed by it all. Whether this is genuine resilience, profound denial, or simply the inability of someone raised in extreme privilege to truly grasp the consequences of his actions remains unclear. He reportedly maintains his innocence, continues to vigorously deny the allegations against him, and appears to believe that he has been unfairly treated by the media and the public. This disconnect between Andrew's self-perception and the reality of the situation is perhaps the most troubling aspect of the entire saga. Virginia Giuffre is dead, having taken her own life after years of fighting for accountability. Countless other victims of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell continue to live with the trauma of what was done to them. The institutions that enabled Epstein, the powerful men who benefited from his trafficking operation, have faced relatively little in the way of consequences. And Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor, despite losing his titles, still lives in comfort, still benefits from the support of his brother the king, still seems to view himself as the victim of a witch hunt rather than as someone who should be held accountable for his choices and associations. The British monarchy has survived scandals before. The abdication crisis of 1936, the divorce of Charles and Diana in the 1990s, the death of Princess Diana in 1997, all of these moments tested the institution and forced it to adapt. The Andrew saga is different in some ways because it involves allegations of criminal conduct, of complicity in sex trafficking, of the abuse of a minor. These are not matters of personal indiscretion or failed marriages, they are serious accusations that strike at the heart of what the monarchy claims to represent. The decision to strip Andrew of his titles is significant, but it also raises questions about why it took so long, why the institution was so reluctant to act, why it required a posthumous memoir and overwhelming public pressure to finally force accountability. Critics of the monarchy point to this as evidence that the institution is fundamentally incapable of policing itself, that it prioritizes protecting its own members over doing what is right, and that it only acts when it has no other choice. Supporters of the monarchy argue that King Charles has now done what needed to be done, that Andrew has faced consequences for his actions, and that the institution has demonstrated its willingness to hold even princes accountable when their conduct becomes indefensible. They point to the decisive nature of the October 30th announcement, the use of letters patent to formally strip Andrew of his titles, and the very public nature of his banishment as evidence that the monarchy takes these matters seriously. They note that Andrew has been reduced from a prince to a private citizen in all but name, that he has lost everything that gave him status and identity, and that this represents a serious punishment for someone who clearly valued his royal position above all else. The truth likely lies somewhere in between these two perspectives. The monarchy acted, but only after years of delay and only after the pressure became unbearable. Andrew has faced consequences, but he also continues to live in relative comfort with financial support from his brother. The institution has demonstrated a willingness to cut loose a member who has become a liability, but it has also shown how reluctant it is to do so and how much protection it will extend to its own for as long as possible. The Andrew saga is a case study in how power protects itself, how institutions prioritize their own survival, and how accountability for the wealthy and well-connected is always conditional and often incomplete. As November 2025 progresses and the story continues to unfold, several key questions remain unanswered. Will Andrew ultimately cooperate with investigations into Jeffrey Epstein and provide testimony about what he knew and when he knew it? Will more names emerge from the Epstein files, and will any of those names face meaningful consequences? Will Andrew's finances finally be subjected to proper scrutiny, and will the sources of his wealth be revealed? Will he comply with the order to leave Royal Lodge, or will there be a protracted legal battle over the lease? Will Sarah Ferguson maintain her silence about her ex-husband, or will she eventually speak out about what she knows? Will Princesses Beatrice and Eugenie continue to stand by their father, or will they distance themselves to protect their own reputations and those of their families? And perhaps most importantly, will Virginia Giuffre's death by suicide in April 2025 and the publication of her memoir lead to meaningful change in how society treats victims of sex trafficking and abuse? Will her courage in speaking out, her determination to seek accountability, and her willingness to detail her experiences in her own words inspire other survivors to come forward? Will it force institutions to act more swiftly and decisively when faced with allegations of abuse by powerful individuals? Will it shift the culture from one that protects abusers to one that believes and supports victims? These are the questions that extend far beyond Prince Andrew and the British royal family, questions that speak to fundamental issues of power, justice, and human dignity. The stripping of Prince Andrew's titles in October and November 2025 represents a historic moment, but it is also just one chapter in a much larger story. The Epstein scandal continues to reverberate through the halls of power around the world, implicating politicians, billionaires, celebrities, and royalty. The victims, many of whom were children when they were trafficked and abused, continue to live with the trauma of what was done to them. Some, like Virginia Giuffre, have paid the ultimate price, their strength finally exhausted by years of fighting for recognition and justice. Others continue to fight, demanding that all of the abusers and enablers connected to Epstein and Maxwell be held accountable, not just the ones who happen to be convenient scapegoats or who have outlived their usefulness to the powerful. In the end, the Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor story is not really about one disgraced prince. It is about a system that protected him for far too long. It is about institutions that value their own reputation over the well-being of victims. It is about how wealth and privilege insulate individuals from consequences until public pressure becomes overwhelming. It is about the courage of survivors like Virginia Giuffre who refused to be silenced, who refused to accept that powerful men were above the law, and who sacrificed their own peace and ultimately their lives in pursuit of accountability. It is about whether we as a society are truly committed to believing victims, supporting survivors, and ensuring that no one, not even a prince, is beyond the reach of justice. As Andrew Mountbatten Windsor faces an uncertain future, stripped of his titles but not yet fully held accountable, as the British royal family attempts to move forward from this scandal, and as the Epstein files continue to be released with the potential to implicate many more powerful individuals, the world watches and waits. The reckoning that began with Virginia Giuffre's decision to speak out, that accelerated with the publication of Nobody's Girl, and that reached a new phase with Andrew's loss of his princely status, is far from over. The question is not whether more revelations will emerge, more names will be exposed, more demands for accountability will be made. The question is whether those revelations will lead to meaningful change, whether those names will face real consequences, whether those demands will be met with action rather than further delay and obfuscation. The answer to that question will determine not just Andrew's legacy, but the legacy of an entire era in which the powerful abused the vulnerable with impunity while the rest of the world looked away. Now, finally, the world is looking, and it is demanding answers. Will it get them, or will the institutions of power find new ways to protect their own? That is the question that haunts this story and that will define what comes next. So after everything you have learned about this unprecedented fall from grace, after understanding the allegations that brought down a prince, after hearing Virginia Giuffre's voice through her memoir, after witnessing the British monarchy take the extraordinary step of stripping one of their own of his titles, after seeing how long it took for accountability to arrive and how incomplete that accountability still is, we have to ask ourselves a difficult question that goes beyond just this one case. When powerful people are accused of serious wrongdoing, when victims come forward at great personal cost to tell their stories, when the evidence points to complicity in terrible crimes, how long should it take before consequences arrive? Should victims have to wait years, decades, or even until after their deaths for their voices to be heard and believed? Should institutions be allowed to protect their own members indefinitely, only acting when public pressure becomes unbearable? And most importantly, what does real accountability look like, and have we seen it here, or is Andrew Mountbatten Windsor's loss of titles just another example of powerful people facing symbolic consequences while continuing to live in comfort and privilege? What do you think true justice would look like in this case?